So let's now move to item 18. And if we can invite staff to the table. Thank you very much. Were there any preliminary comments that you wanted to make on this report?
Screen.
Oh, sorry, was that question aimed at us?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
already got a whole presentation. This is good. Okay, great.
This is a draft submission on the Government Policy Statement, or GPS as it's commonly known, on land transport funding. And essentially what the government does is gains revenue primarily from road users through fuel excise duty, road user charges, motor vehicle registration, and that goes into a hypothecated fund. And hypothecated essentially means that it can only be used for land transport, and that's to the tune of $3 or $4 billion per annum. So it's a chunky amount of money. And what they do is they allocate that into activity classes, and they consult on that document as to what those activity classes and other directions look like every 3 years. And at the moment they have released the draft GPS for comment, and so what you have in front of you is Council's response to that. And the issues we've raised in there is a number of matters, but primarily there's two key things which we think are of importance to us. First is that they draw a strong correlation between what is VKT, or vehicle kilometres travelled, and an increase in gross domestic product. So essentially what they are implying is that the more vehicle kilometres that you have travelled, what you'll see is an increase in your gross domestic product. And I guess what we've experienced recently in Christchurch is a dispersed land use pattern. So you have more people living outside of Christchurch travelling in. So understandably you have more vehicle kilometres travelled. However, what you don't necessarily have as a result of that is an increase in gross domestic product. So we think that correlation is potentially flawed. What you could have is, and what that essentially does is drives investment in infrastructure which will cater for that increased demand. So what you have is a funding regime which continues to fund to a large proportion of improvements and maintenance on state highway networks. And what we'd like to see from a staff perspective, and if you're in agreement to this, is an increase in focus on more sustainable travel options, because you don't necessarily need to see an increase in vehicle kilometres travelled to see an increase in gross domestic product if indeed people are living in more denser living environments, if indeed people are using more sustainable travel options. So that's a key thesis to our submission. And we do have some graphs which kind of show what the percentages are and what the activity classes are that sit within the GPS.
Yes, so largely this sort of shows where the funding comes from. So largely fuel excise duty and road user charges, and sort of largely where it's spent as well. So the document is a policy document and a policy statement. It sets direction, but where it has teeth is really in these funding class bands or ranges. So we've got sort of three key policies of safety, economic productivity, and value for money. And so they speak to sort of the rationale as to why the funding classes are the way they are. So our submission sort of responds to that and sort of suggests some alternative direction for the policy and for the funding. The expenditure in activity classes has grown and changed over time. You can't quite see down the bottom, but that top line there is basically spending in state highways. There's been a lot of state highway building over the past 8 years, and we haven't sort of seen those proportional increases in things like walking, cycling, and public transport, which of course can have economic benefits and improve road safety and value for money as well. So I'll just skip through sort of these. On the left, there's sort of the change in spending up until about 2007. That top blue line is an increase in PT spending from the 1997 baseline. that basically stopped in 2008, 2009, and state highways sort of predominantly took the lion's share of funding. The policy, the draft GPS we've got isn't largely different to the direction we've seen in recent years. There's still a large allocation of funding towards state highways, and this is we're just providing a bit of context as to what's happened in the past, so we can sort of comment on the document now. This shows in detail sort of the some of those funding ranges. Those are the grey bands, and the red and yellow is where they've been allocated. And so you can see some of them are sort of in the middle of the funding range, and some of them are really close to being oversubscribed. So, well, can't quite point, but local road maintenance is something that is typically very close to being oversubscribed, as well as walking and cycling. Very small amount of funding compared to the entire NLTF pool, but there's obviously a lot of demand for funding in those activity classes, whereas everything's most other funding bands are sort of within the allocated range. This shows projected allocations out to from the last GPS up until about 2027, 2028. So as projects come online and sort of are planned in sort of the near and medium term, that's where the funding is allocated. This is sort of like the long-term plan for the NLTF. So still a large amount of highway funding that's going to be proposed to be spent, but it hasn't actually been allocated to any projects yet. And you can see up until about 2021, 2022, there aren't a lot of projects sort of in the pipeline beyond that. So there is a lot of room to change, and the GPS is clear that this really is focusing on the next sort of 3 to 5 years, and beyond that sort of hasn't been set in stone, so to speak. So the key points of our submission are that we should really be looking, when we talk about economic benefits, we should really be looking at triple bottom line and including social and environmental costs and benefits alongside just economic growth. And as Richard pointed out, we think there is a bit of flawed logic in just growing vehicle kilometres travelled and getting an increase in GDP. We think there's also a strong case to be made for the GPS to talk about shifting modes away from single occupant vehicles into walking, cycling, public transport, because there's a whole raft of benefits that you get from that. You get safety, you get excellent value for money in terms of benefit cost ratio, and the GPS doesn't really talk about that in great detail. With regard to safety, we think there could be an opportunity for the GPS to enable territorial authorities to set a really bold direction in terms of safety. There's a number of cities around the world that have begun to adopt a Vision Zero for their cities and city centres, based on the assumption that it's absolutely unacceptable to have any amount of deaths or serious injuries. And in the past, that hasn't been the direction of the government's Safer Journey strategy. So there's an opportunity here to influence that and provide a lot stronger direction for safety, and have a vision, enable us to have our own Vision Zero, a much more ambitious target for road safety in urban areas.
That's us.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So let's move to questions. Phil?
Thanks very much for your work on this. I just wondered, and like we've got excuse me if I missed it, and I have read it carefully, but we've got a big agenda. The link between exhaust emissions and pollution and a whole government's really policy about reducing carbon emissions. I'm just wondering, in fact, if we should, and when it comes to public transport, if we should make that stronger.
Currently,
if there's a place to actually refer to that other government policy.
So the GPS draws from a range of other government policy frameworks. So some of them are for instance, the new Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority have set their strategic direction as well. So the raft of government policy government policies are supposed to align and to talk to each other. The GPS is really about sort of transport policy and transport funding, but yes, there probably should be something in there, and we can make suggestion to that funding and policy direction should more closely align to strategic directions from the Ministry of Environment and ECA.
Thanks, Nick. That would be good.
Thank you. I've got Yanni, Sarah, and then Dion. Yanni.
Yeah, I just had two questions, I guess, in terms of whether it's appropriate to put this in the submission. The first is that on page 5 of their policy statement, they talk about value for money, and they talk about the public transport operating contracts have increased competition, and I guess in Christchurch, my experience would be that having a competitive public transport system has been a failed model. It's cost us a huge amount of money, and we've seen a deterioration in the quality of public transport, and you'll recall a few years ago what happened with the buses, the cheap buses being imported from overseas, and the police operation. So I just wondered if this is the opportunity for us to at least make some comment about having the ability to have a more cooperative or a community public transport system rather than a competitive one. E.g. in a city like Christchurch, where you've got 3 different organisations making decisions over public transport, actually maybe what we want is just to have a different model. So are we able to have something about that in here?
Again, this is something that we can possibly allude to. The PTOM legislation and sort of policy direction is a separate document to the GPS, but it is like the ECA strategic direction. It is one of these documents that the GPS should be in line with and should be talking to.
Yeah.
So in the GPS, I suppose we could allude to present structures in the public transport configuration, PTOM, fare box recovery, things like that. But there are sort of separate documents that speak to that direction as well. Right. So in terms of how much we'd be able to influence that through this, possibly a little bit, but the direction is set by sort of a separate policy and a separate piece of legislation.
But the GPS seems to be making the point that we get value for money from a competitive public transport model. What we've seen in Christchurch is actually we get a much lower quality of service, and we lose the ability to have, particularly post-disaster, a sensible approach. So I personally would like something even at a high level in our submission on that. The second question I had was just around the issue of maintenance, and again, one of the things happening in Christchurch is because the roads aren't being repaired to a full standard, what we're going to see is a huge increase in the maintenance costs, which would indicate that it's not value for money. So a very short-term approach by government, and there is some comment in here that the maintenance is that they've looked at their maintenance and it's having better impacts. Of course, in Christchurch, we've probably got the opposite, where we see, we're going to have to struggle for a long time to get recognition of investment because we haven't had that subsidy to do the things properly post-earthquake. So again, just wondered if there was opportunity to maybe just reflect on
yeah, we can make amendments to the submission. The deadline is the 31st of March, so we've got some time to include that in the submission. Talk about value for money, local road maintenance, renewals, and sort of make that maybe another key point as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So just in terms of process, will you pick up these issues as changes that you'll make to the proposed submission, or do we need to be passing a resolution that reflects those things? And
we can pick up the changes, put them in track changes into the document, and if you want to put something on there about a resolution about it being delegated to the CEO or to the Mayor or to the ITE committee.
What maybe to the Mayor and the Chair of the ITE committee would be appropriate?
Yep. We can do that and then circulate it for approval. And closing date for submissions or comments is the 31st of March.
Okay. Yep, no, that's fine. Okay, so next set of questions, Sarah.
Thank you. Just a question around, I was trying to find it and I couldn't. The vehicle kilometres travelled. My understanding is that actually most vehicle kilometres travelled aren't on the state highways, and yet they take up a really, really large chunk of all of the money. And so whether we're able to, whether it was worth, when we talk about balancing things, actually being a bit more specific in there about where we would like money to come from when it comes to that. And because if we're taking it away from the state highways and spending more potentially on the local road maintenance, but lowering congestion on in those local areas by using the public transport and cycling, those kind of things. Because the state highway network actually doesn't carry the majority of travel, but has, 90% of the funding. So, we could be more specific on that.
We can look into that. I'm not sure the answer off the top of my head, but we can look into it and adjust the submission accordingly.
Yep.
Be a bit more specific.
Thank you. Dion?
Thank you. In the road user charges, is there a breakdown between heavy vehicles and say, consumer vehicles?
That data would be available, and the information I presented in the slides, I think it's all in one pool. So the road user charges and the fuel excise duty at a very high level, I've presented it all in the same bucket, but that data would be available.
We can track it down and circulate.
Yeah, I'd personally like to look at it, and one of the things there is that, I just know from looking at our roads in Christchurch with the heavy vehicles that are on the road from the recovery and the rebuild, we're seeing a lot more maintenance costs being borne because of that. And I just wanted to see if there was any way we could actually sort of signal that, those heavy vehicles that are actually using the road system could actually start, if in fact that is actually into the sort of subsidies that all the costs that we bear, and get that money back through those road user charges. In the urban environment, yeah, because, we are in a unique situation here in Christchurch, and I have seen, and if you just look around, you see the trucks are doing a very much amount of damage, and with the recovery, there's been a very big increase in trucks on the road. Have we thought about that at all?
Well, it's certainly, I think the issue of maintenance and local road and funding for local road improvements and maintenance is an issue which we do need to perhaps bring out a bit stronger in there. So it's not just specific to the heavy vehicles, it is a funding issue across the country.
Yeah, heavy vehicles do, proportionately a huge amount more damage as they get heavier. It sort of goes exponentially up. So, thank you. That's all I wanted to raise.
Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, just on the funding thing too, I'm wondering that as we go into the future and increase the use of electric cars and possibly PT, and most of the funding comes from fuel tax and road user charges. Yes. So how will then the funding pool would be anticipated to drop a little bit, so will they need to be looking at other ways to perhaps road user charges across all vehicles and less tax on the fuel?
Yep.
But is that our place to comment on that? Or?
They do. The ministry has mentioned this a few times, and it is in the document talking about future technology and technology enablers. So the likely direction in future for road user charges will be some sort of metering. So it could be vehicles fitted out as a pay per kilometre basis. So it is touched on in terms of technology, and we sort of tend to agree that the funding model is probably not as sustainable as it is at present, but the ministry is looking into other ways to gather road user charges and to fund the National Land Transport Program.
That's cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah. Did you not consider being more bold? Because I think if you looked back in 10 years at this document and where transport would be at, that you'd kind of go, man, did we actually write that back then? Whereas I think the world's going to change so dramatically in the next 10 and certainly 20, transport-wise, that we're such a small country with quite a bit of money, and we're the second largest city here, that we should be really bold, when you're talking autonomous vehicles. I've got no doubt that within 10 years we'll see a flood of them. Electric vehicles are already here, so the next step is obviously autonomous, and then your road toll can potentially, once every vehicle's integrated, head for zero. We won't aim for 300s and 200s anymore, we'll aim for zero, and did you consider that?
In writing the submission, thinking about the really high-level key points we wanted to emphasise, mentioning Vision Zero, I felt was quite bold. It wasn't something that I don't think any city in Australasia has committed to, but it is definitely sort of becoming more prevalent in policy and in terms of civic direction. So we did mention that. In terms of technology, no doubt this will have an impact. There are still a few scenarios that we'll need to sort of think about, test and model, and the ministry has forecast a range that might say, well, we could, in theory, autonomous vehicles could actually increase the vehicle kilometres travelled if you could use your time to read the paper or whatever. You might live further away, but then there's a scenario where we could see dramatic decreases in vehicle kilometres travelled. The direction, the key point we've made about this premise of VKT and the economy, and we want to sort of separate those things out, we feel might address that concern of the self-fulfilling prophecy of just building more and more highways. So we're sort of trying to make that clear, but I feel it might sort of address the question around what the future might hold for vehicle technologies, autonomous vehicles, things like that. Because we are having to think about it really, really carefully now, and we do mention in the document that these transport investments last a generation. So we're at this point now where we need to think really, really carefully and constantly review plans, constantly review what's budgeted projects, and we're urging the Ministry and NZTA to do the same.
I think the key thing for this, Councillor, is this is a policy document on funding. That New Zealand as a whole, we don't have a transport strategy as a country. I mean, we have one as a council, we don't have one as a country, but this is specific to funding more than anything else. It does give you some sneak peeks about things that you've talked about, but only really in that broader discussion about funding. So I think that's the context within which we need to consider it.
Kind of my point, that we need to invest a lot in that technology side, because that's where the changes and the savings to the country will really come longer term, is around that, is that we will need some funding to take that leap and be a leader. Like, if you even look at our traffic light system, it's just bizarre. It's so old, and you consider the traffic light with 20 cars and it's red. It doesn't even know you're there. Like, it's cell phone technology could tell the traffic light you're there. So there's so many things we're so far behind on we can invest in, but yeah, that's my point.
All right, thank you very much. So thanks for the answers to those questions. Now, what we've got in front of us now is a couple of resolutions, the second of which approves the comment to the Ministry of Transport contained in Attachment A, subject to the amendments discussed, and I'm working on an assumption that people are generally comfortable with those amendments being included. Certainly haven't heard any pushback on that. And final approval to be granted by the Mayor and the Chair of the Infrastructure, Transport and Environment Committee, so Pauline, which would then allow us to have the submission in place by the deadline of the 31st of March. Pauline. Happy to move. Do we have a second? Mike's happy to second. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. Thank you very much. Okay, so moving on,